The rain in London doesn't just fall. It seeps into your bones, cold and relentless, much like the realization that your own flesh and blood has just discarded you like a piece of terminal trash. I stood by the glass partitions of Gate Mouillebonne at Heathrow, my breath fogging the window as I watched the silver wing of a Boeing Bay Chumbe Mouille catch the gray morning light. My ex-wife, Victoria Harrison, hadn't even looked back. My son, Leo, had but only to check if I was still standing there, a pathetic figure in a faded navy windbreaker, clutching a boarding pass that was now as worthless as my dignity. I checked my pocket. $12 in crumpled bills and a few British pence. That was it. That was the sum total of my worth in their eyes. 3 hours ago, Victoria had stood in the middle of the terminal, her voice projecting with that practiced, melodic cruelty she'd spent years perfecting in the high society circles of Boston's Beacon Hill. She'd told everyone within a 20-foot radius that I was a charity case, an embarrassment to the Harrison name, and a man who couldn't even afford his own transit. She'd laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound, as she and Leo walked toward the first-class boarding lane, leaving me behind without a ticket, a hotel, or a way home. They thought they were leaving behind a failure. They thought they were finally cutting the anchor that kept them from drifting into the stratosphere of the true elite. What they didn't know was that every sneer, every calculated insult, and the final, crushing act of abandonment had been witnessed. What they didn't know was that my grandfather, Alistair Sterling, is the silent hand behind a $340 million steel and logistics empire. And what they definitely didn't know was that their little display of social cleansing had just triggered a dormant clause in a massive inheritance, a clause designed specifically to weed out the vultures from the family tree. In 72 hours, Victoria and Leo would go from anticipating a $51 million windfall to finding the locks changed and their bank accounts bleeding dry. And it all began with a single trembling phone call I made while watching their plane disappear into the low-hanging clouds over the Atlantic. If you've ever been the one everyone looked down on, the one the family whispered about at Christmas, you're going to want to hear how the quietest man in the room took everything back. My name is Julian Sterling, though for the last 15 years, I'd gone by Julian Harrison to appease Victoria's obsession with her old money lineage. For 3 years following our divorce, Victoria and Leo had treated my life like a cautionary tale. It started with the small things, the way Leo stopped calling me Dad the moment he turned 21, replacing it with a cold, detached Julian. It was as if he were trying to scrub the very DNA from his system. At family functions I was still forced to attend for the sake of appearances. Victoria would introduce me to her new associates as a distant connection, or, more frequently, Leo's biological donor. I remember a specific night 6 months ago. We were at a high-end steakhouse in Back Bay, one of those places where the menus don't have prices and the waiters wear white gloves. Victoria had ordered a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly rent, just so she could swirl it in front of me. I was wearing a polo I'd bought on sale at a department store, and Leo spent the entire meal staring at the small, frayed thread on my collar. "Do you have to do that, Julian?" Leo had asked, his voice dripping with a boredom that cut deeper than anger. "Do what, Leo?" I'd replied, trying to maintain a smile. "Exist so," loudly, he said, gesturing to my shirt. "Mom's new partner, Pierce Montgomery, just closed a $10 million merger. He wears bespoke Italian silk. You look like you're waiting for a bus to a job you're about to lose." Victoria had smirked, dabbing her lips with a silk napkin. "Now, Leo, don't be cruel. Your father is content with his modest life. He lives in that charming little 400-foot studio. It's very bohemian, isn't it, Julian? I imagine the smell of the hallway trash really adds to the aesthetic." I sat there, driving my fingernails into my palms. I lived in that studio because I'd walked away from the divorce with nothing but my integrity, while Victoria had used her family's legal team to strip me of the assets I'd actually helped build. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. I worked a steady, quiet job in archival research. To them, I was a ghost, a reminder of a past they wanted to bury under layers of Cartier and Hampton's real estate. "I'm your father, Leo," I'd said that night, my voice barely a whisper. "I taught you how to ride a bike. I spent every weekend at your hockey games when you were 10. Leo hadn't even looked up from his phone. "People change, Julian. Some people move up. Others stay in the basement. I'm building a future with people who actually have something to offer. Pierce is putting me on the board of his new firm." "What can you give me?" A discount code for your dented car's insurance? The restaurant had gone silent as Victoria chimed in, her voice rising so the tables nearby could hear. He can't even afford to take you to a movie, Leo, let alone give you a career. Honestly, Julian, why do you even show up? Is it the free meal? Do you need us to pack a doggy bag for you? I'd stood up, my face burning, and walked out into the cold Boston air. I'd driven home in my rattling car, sat on my twin-sized bed, and stared at a framed photo of my grandfather, Alistair. He was a man of iron and silence, a man who had intentionally let the world and his own family believe he had retired into modest obscurity in a small Pennsylvania town. He'd told me once, "Julian, the world only shows you its true face when it thinks you have nothing to give it. Watch, listen. And when they think you're at your weakest, that's when you'll know who they really are." I hadn't realized then that Alistair had been watching them too. He'd seen the way Victoria treated me during the divorce. He'd seen the way Leo had been molded into a carbon copy of his mother's vanity, and he had devised a test. The trip to London was the bait. Victoria had called me out of the blue, her voice uncharacteristically sweet. "Julian," she'd said, "there's a massive international gala for the Sterling Foundation in London. Since you're technically still the only direct link to Alistair's name, even if he is a pauper now, the organizers want the family there. If you come and play the part of the dutiful ex-husband for 3 days, I'll make sure Leo spends some quality time with you. I'll even cover the hotel." I should have seen the jagged edges beneath the silk. I wanted a relationship with my son so badly that I'd ignored the warning signs. I'd scraped together my savings, bought a ticket I couldn't afford, and flew across the ocean, hoping for a breakthrough. Instead, I'd spent 48 hours being treated like a servant. I carried their luggage, the matching designer sets, that cost more than my car. I sat in the back of the town cars, while Victoria and Leo discussed Pierce Montgomery's upcoming proposal. The breaking point, the moment that changed the trajectory of all our lives, happened at the airport this morning. We were supposed to fly back together, but as we stood at the check-in counter, Victoria leaned in and whispered to the agent. Then, she turned to me, a look of faux sympathy on her face. "There's been a bit of a mix-up, Julian," she said, loud enough for the entire queue to hear. "It seems your ticket was canceled, some issue with the payment, and since the flight is overbooked, there's nothing they can do." "What? Victoria, you said you handled the booking," I said, panic rising in my chest. Leo stepped forward, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Actually, I canceled it, Julian. We decided that the flight back would be much more pleasant without your presence. You've spent 3 days ruining our photos and embarrassing us in front of the Sterling's associates. It's time you learned to fly on your own wings." "I don't have any money for another ticket, Leo," I said, my voice cracking. "I have $12 and a credit card. That's at its limit." Victoria laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. She reached into her purse, pulled out a handful of loose coins, and tossed them onto the floor at my feet. "Then I suggest you start walking. Or perhaps you can find a job sweeping the terminals. You're not our responsibility anymore, Julian. You're a grown man who's achieved nothing. It's time we stop pretending you're part of this family." She and Leo turned their backs on me, walking through the priority lane, laughing as they disappeared toward the lounge. The people in line stared at me, some with pity, others with the same cold indifference Victoria had cultivated. I stood there, looking at the coins on the floor, the $12 in my pocket, and the rain lashing against the windows. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It wasn't to Alistair, it was to Eleanor Vance, the head of the legal department at Sterling Global. "Eleanor," I said, my voice steadying, "this is Julian. They did it. They actually did it. They left me stranded at Heathrow." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a pen clicking. "I'm sorry, Julian. I truly am. But you know what this means. The character and integrity clause in your grandfather's will, it's no longer a hypothetical. By abandoning a family member in a foreign country without means, Victoria and Leo have officially triggered the forfeiture." "How long do they have?" I asked. "The amended will is being filed as we speak," Eleanor replied. "By the time they land in Boston, they won't be coming home to a mansion, they'll be coming home to a lockout notice. And Julian, your grandfather wants to see you. The private jet is being rerouted to the private terminal at Heathrow. It'll be there in 20 minutes. I looked out at the runway. The plane carrying my ex-wife and my son was taxiing toward the start of the strip. They thought they were flying toward a future of endless wealth. They didn't realize they were currently sitting on a ticking time bomb, and I was the one holding the remote. But as I turned to walk toward the private terminal, I saw a man in a dark coat standing near the newsstand, watching me. He held a camera casually, but his eyes were locked on mine. It was Mick, the private investigator Alistair had hired to shadow us. He gave me a somber nod and tapped his pocket, indicating he had the footage. Everything was recorded, every insult, every coin tossed on the floor. I didn't know it yet, but the next 72 hours wouldn't just be about money. It would be about the total systematic deconstruction of the woman who had ruined me and the son who had disowned me. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo. It read, "Don't bother calling. We've blocked your number. Enjoy the rain, loser." I deleted the message and looked up at the sky. The rain was still falling, but for the first time in 15 years, I felt completely, terrifyingly warm. The game had finally changed, and Victoria Harrison was about to find out that the man she called a failure was now the only man who could save her from the street. The walk from Terminal High to the private aviation suite was less than a mile, but it felt like a journey across two different universes. Behind me, in the bustling chaos of the main airport, I was a ghost, a middle-aged man with no flight and a pocket full of change. But as I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the signature flight support building, the air changed. It was thick with the scent of expensive leather, espresso, and the quiet, heavy hum of true power. "Mr. Sterling," a woman in a charcoal suit stood up from behind a marble desk. She didn't look at my wet windbreaker or my cheap sneakers. She looked at my eyes, and she saw the man my grandfather had been training me to be for 40 years. "The Silver Hawk is fueled and ready on the tarmac," she said, her voice a soft, professional purr. "Ms. Vance is already on board. May I take your bag?" I looked down at the tattered duffel bag I'd bought at a discount store 3 years ago. "No," I said, my voice sounding more like iron than I expected. "I'll carry it. It's a reminder." As I walked across the tarmac toward the Gulf Stream, Xiao Chumnamui, a $70 million miracle of engineering, I watched the commercial planes taking off in the distance. Somewhere in that sky, Victoria and Leo were clinking champagne glasses in first class, laughing about how they'd finally pruned the dead branch from their family tree. They thought they were the ones ascending. They didn't realize that while they were flying at 30,000 feet, I was about to own the very air they were breathing. I climbed the stairs of the jet, and the seal hissed shut behind me. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had managed the Sterling family's legal secrets for 3 decades, was sitting in a swivel chair, a tablet in her hand, and a glass of sparkling water on the side table. She looked up, her expression a mix of professional steel and genuine pity. "You look like hell, Julian," she said. "I feel like the $12 in my pocket," I replied, sinking into a seat that probably cost more than my first apartment. "Well," Eleanor said, sliding the tablet toward me, "by the time we touch down in Boston, those $12 will be the only thing you have in common with your ex-wife. This is the timeline for the asset seizure. Your grandfather didn't just want them cut off, he wanted them to feel the floor fall away in real time." I stared at the screen. It was a digital map of Victoria's life. The mansion on Beacon Hill, the summer house in Martha's Vineyard, the fleet of cars, the trust funds. All of them were highlighted in red. Red meant pending repossession. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and for a moment, the hum of the jet engines faded, replaced by the memory of the day it all started to go wrong. I didn't know it yet, but the seeds of this betrayal weren't sown in London. They were planted 10 years ago at Leo's 11th birthday party. At the time, we were still the Harrisons. I was working 60 hours a week at a logistics firm, trying to build a life that matched Victoria's expectations. Her family, the Kensingtons, had old name status, but very little liquid cash, which made Victoria obsessed with the appearance of wealth. I was the workhorse. I was the one who made the numbers work so she could host the right garden parties. For Leo's birthday, I'd planned something simple, a camping trip, just the two of us, some fishing rods, and a tent in the Maine woods. I wanted to show him what my grandfather had shown me, that a man's worth is measured by what he can do with his hands and his heart, not his wallet. I'd come home early that Friday, the car packed with gear, only to find the driveway of our suburban home blocked by a fleet of caterers. Victoria was standing on the lawn in a pristine white sundress, directing men as they set up a massive inflatable water park and a professional DJ booth. "What is this, Victoria?" I'd asked, stepping out of the car. She'd looked at me like I was a smudge on her windshield. It's a birthday party, Julian. A real one. I invited the Montgomerys, the Sterlings, the real Sterlings, and half the board of the country club. You didn't honestly think I was going to let you take our son to sleep in the dirt like a vagrant, did you? We had a plan, I said, my voice rising. Leo was excited. Leo was polite, she snapped. But look at him. I looked toward the house. Leo was standing on the porch, wearing a miniature version of a designer suit. He was surrounded by kids whose parents owned sports teams. When he saw me, he didn't run down to the car. He didn't ask about the fishing rods. He looked at my dusty SUV, then at his friends, and he turned his back. He was embarrassed. At 11 years old, his mother had already taught him that his father was the budget version of a man. That was the first time I felt the cold wind of the future. I'd spent the next decade trying to fight it, trying to be the good dad, the steady presence. But Victoria was a master of psychological erosion. She didn't just tell him I was a failure, she showed him. Every time I bought him a gift that wasn't a brand name, she'd accidentally lose it. Every time I tried to talk to him about hard work, she'd interrupt to talk about the inheritance he'd one day receive from the Sterling side of the family. She didn't know that Alistair Sterling, the man she talked about like a mythic god of gold, was my grandfather. She knew the Sterling name was powerful, but she thought Alistair was a distant, eccentric relative who had lost his fortune years ago and lived in a shabby house in Pennsylvania. I'd kept the truth from her because Alistair had asked me to. If she knows the size of the mountain, Julian. Alistair had warned me when we got engaged, she'll never stop climbing it. Let her think the mountain is a hill. Let's see if she stays for the view or the climb. She didn't stay for either. The moment she realized I wasn't going to inherit $1 billion the day we turned 30, her love began to evaporate. By the time our divorce was finalized 3 years ago, she had convinced herself and Leo that I had somehow cheated them out of their rightful place in the world. Julian, Eleanor's voice snapped me back to the present. I opened my eyes. We were over the Atlantic. The cabin was dim, illuminated only by the soft blue light of the floor runners. There's something you need to see, Eleanor said, her face grim. Mick, the investigator, just sent over the audio from the first-class cabin. He's sitting 3 rows behind them. She tapped a button on her tablet. The sound was a bit muffled by the plane's engine, but the voices were unmistakable. Did you see his face, Mom? That was Leo. He sounded giddy, like he'd just won a championship. When you dropped those coins, I thought he was going to cry right there in the terminal. It was a mercy, Leo. Victoria's voice followed, smooth and cold. If we'd brought him back, he'd just be a weight around our necks for the Montgomery wedding. Pierce's family doesn't need to see the studio apartment version of a Sterling. By the time he finds a way back to the States, the story will be set. He went on a bender in London and disappeared. We're the victims here. The abandoned wife and son. And the money? Leo asked. The Sterling Trust? The lawyers say it's as good as ours, Victoria said, and I could practically hear the smirk. Old Alistair is 94. He's senile. He'll sign whatever Eleanor Vance puts in front of him, and Eleanor works for the name, not the man. Once we have that 51 million, we never have to say the name Julian again. He can rot in that London rain for all I care. The audio cut out. The cabin of the private jet was silent, except for the roar of the wind outside. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't the searing pain I'd felt at the airport. It was something colder, something more permanent. It was the feeling of a bridge finally collapsing, leaving me on one side and the people I'd loved on the other. They think I'm senile? A voice boomed from the back of the plane. I turned. A door at the rear of the cabin opened, and Alistair Sterling stepped out. He was 94, yes, but he stood as straight as a steel beam. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt and corduroy pants, the outfit of a man who didn't need to prove his wealth to anyone. He was holding a glass of scotch, and his eyes were burning with a terrifying clarity. "Grandfather," I said, standing up, "I thought you were meeting us in Boston." "I couldn't miss the show, Julian," he said, walking over and placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "I've been in the bedroom suite since we took off. I heard every word of that recording." He looked at Eleanor. "Is it ready?" "The forfeiture for moral turpitude clause is active, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said. The moment Victoria and Leo landed their feet on the tarmac in Boston, the Sterling Family Trust, which pays for the Beacon Hill house, the cars, and Leo's tuition, will be legally dissolved. Their personal accounts, which were commingled with the trust for tax purposes, have been frozen for audit. Alistair looked at me. You've been quiet for a long time, Julian. You've let them kick you. You've let them treat you like a dog. Do you have the stomach for what comes next? What comes next? I asked. Alistair leaned in, his voice a low growl. We aren't just cutting them off, Julian. We're giving them a front-row seat to your ascension. In 48 hours, the Sterling Foundation Gala is happening in Boston. Every person Victoria has ever tried to impress will be there. And you, my boy, will be introduced as the new chairman of Sterling Global. I looked at the $12 still sitting on the side table. They're going to fight this, grandfather. Victoria has connections. She'll call Pierce Montgomery. Alistair chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Let her call him. What she doesn't know is that Pierce Montgomery owes me $40 million in mezzanine debt. By tomorrow morning, Pierce Montgomery won't even answer her texts. The jet began its descent into the gray clouds over Massachusetts. I looked out the window, watching the lights of the coast begin to flicker into view. Somewhere down there, Victoria and Leo were landing. They were probably calling an Uber Black, expecting to go home to their silk sheets in their high-walled garden. They had no idea that the keys in their pockets were already dead. They had no idea that the senile old man and the failure of a father were currently descending from the heavens like a pair of vengeful gods. Julian, Alistair said as the wheels touched the runway. One more thing. The private investigator, Mick, he didn't just record the audio. He has the video of them leaving you at the gate. He has the video of the coins. I looked at him. What are you going to do with it? Alistair smiled, and for the first time, I saw the ruthless titan who had built an empire from nothing. I'm not going to do anything with it, Julian. You are. You're going to play it on the big screen at the gala, right after Victoria makes her grand entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was no longer just about survival. This was a total execution of their social and financial lives. As the jet taxied toward the private hangar, I saw a black SUV waiting for us. But just as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from a home security app I'd forgotten. I still had access to the one for the Beacon Hill mansion. The alert read, Intrusion detected, front door. Muy bon PM. I realized what was happening. Victoria and Leo had just reached the house. They were trying their codes, and the house was screaming back at them. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of the longest night of their lives. The SUV pulled away from the private hangar, its tires whispering over the rain-slicked tarmac of Logan Airport. I sat in the back seat, the glow of my phone reflecting in the tinted window. The security alerts from the Beacon Hill house were coming in like rapid-fire pulse beats. Front door intrusion, living room motion, master bedroom glass break. They were inside. They had probably found a way through the terrace door, or broken a window in a fit of panicked entitlement. I could almost see Victoria's face, the porcelain mask of her features cracking, as she realized the home she'd used as a weapon against my self-esteem for a decade was no longer hers. I felt a momentary pang of something that felt like guilt, but it was quickly smothered by the memory of those coins clattering on the floor at Heathrow. You're thinking about the why, aren't you? Alistair asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the heater. He didn't look at me. He was staring out at the blurred lights of the Boston skyline. You're wondering how a woman you once loved, and a boy you raised, could become so hollow. I thought I knew them, grandfather, I said. I thought if I just worked harder, if I was just more patient, they'd see me. Alistair turned to me, his eyes sharp. That was your first mistake, Julian. You tried to be a mirror for them, hoping they'd see a better version of themselves in you. But people like Victoria don't want a mirror. They want a pedestal. And when they realized you weren't made of gold, they decided you were made of dirt. The truth was deeper and uglier than a simple personality clash. As we drove toward the Four Seasons in Back Bay, where Alistair kept a permanent residence, the memories began to unfurl like a dark ribbon. I started thinking about the year Haingin Lamuitam. That was the year I almost broke free. I had been working at a mid-sized logistics firm, and I'd spent 18 months quietly developing a proprietary software for supply chain efficiency. It was my ticket out. I'd secured a meeting with a group of venture capitalists in New York. If the deal went through, I would have had the capital to start my own firm, to finally provide the bespoke life Victoria craved, without relying on the pittance she allowed me from her family's dwindling accounts. I remember the night before I was supposed to leave for New York. I'd told Victoria everything. I was excited, energized, a man who finally felt like he was taking the lead. She'd listened with a strange, fixed smile, sipping a martini. That's wonderful, Julian. she'd said. Truly, to think, my husband, the archival researcher, becoming a tech mogul, it's almost adorable. I didn't know it yet, but that adorable dream was being dismantled before I even finished my drink. The next morning, when I arrived in Manhattan, the VCs didn't just pass on the deal, they were cold, hostile, even. They told me they'd received an anonymous tip that my software was built on stolen code from a competitor. The competitor? A firm owned by a rising star named Pierce Montgomery. I was devastated. I'd lost everything, my reputation, my job, my confidence. I'd crawled back to Boston, and Victoria had been there to catch me. "It's okay, darling," she'd whispered, stroking my hair while I sat in our kitchen, shattered. "Some people just aren't meant for the arena. You're a thinker, Julian, not a doer. You just stay here, take that quiet job at the library, and let me handle the social heavy lifting. I'll protect you from the world." For years, I believed her. I believed I was a failure who had been saved by her grace. It wasn't until 3 years later, during the discovery phase of our divorce, that I found a hidden folder on her old laptop. It contained emails to a junior partner at Pierce Montgomery's firm. She'd leaked my schematics. She'd sabotaged her own husband's future just to ensure I stayed small, stayed dependent, and stayed under her thumb. She didn't want a successful husband. She wanted a pet she could kick when she was bored. "She's calling," Eleanor Vance said, holding up a sleek black smartphone. "Victoria. This is her 4th attempt in 10 minutes. "Let it ring," Alistair said. "She's not talking to us. She's talking to the void she created." We reached the hotel, but I didn't go to sleep. I spent the night in the suite's library with Eleanor, going through the final folders of the Sterling Global transition. The numbers were staggering. 340 million in liquid assets, plus the controlling interest in Sterling Steel, Sterling Logistics, and 3 different real estate trusts. "What happened next changed everything for me," I muttered, looking at a photo of Leo, in the file his graduation photo, from a private academy I'd paid for by selling my only inheritance from my father, a classic watch. "What was that?" Eleanor asked, looking up from her laptop. "The day of the divorce settlement," I said. "Leo was 18. I thought he'd want to live with me, at least part-time. I'd found a 2-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy, but it had a view of the park. I walked up to him after the hearing. I asked him if he wanted to see the new place. I could still feel the phantom sting of his words. Leo had looked at me not with anger, but with a soul-crushing pity. "Julian," he'd said, "Mom's taking me to Paris for the summer. We're staying at the George V. You're moving into a place with a view of the park? Which park? The one where the homeless people sleep. I love you, but I can't live like that. I'm a Harrison. We don't do. Modest." He'd turned his back on me and walked to Victoria's waiting Mercedes. That was the moment I realized the rot wasn't just in her, it had migrated. She'd fed him a diet of status and vanity until he couldn't recognize love if it didn't come with a designer label. Suddenly, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text. She frowned, her eyes scanning the screen. "Julian, we have a problem. Or rather, Victoria is trying to create one." She handed me the phone. It was a link to a private social media story, one shared among the elite Beacon Hill circle. It was a video Victoria had just posted. She was standing in the dark, the streetlights of Charles Street behind her. Her hair was artfully disheveled, her eyes red from crying. "I don't know who to turn to," she sobbed into the camera. "My ex-husband, Julian, has somehow hacked into my home security and locked me and my son out in the rain. He's been stalking us since London. He's unstable, he's dangerous, and he's trying to steal our family's legacy because he can't handle his own failures. If anyone sees him, please, be careful." The comments were already pouring in. Disgusting. I always knew he was a creep. "Pierce, do something." "She's playing the victim," I said, a cold anger beginning to replace the fatigue. "She's trying to destroy my reputation before I even take the stage at the gala." "She's doing more than that," Alistair said, walking into the room. He looked refreshed, as if the coming battle was giving him new life. "She's trying to bait you. She wants you to show up at the house, to argue with her, to give her a reason to call the police, and have you arrested for domestic disturbance. If you're in a jail cell on Saturday night, you can't be chairman." "I'm not going to the house," I said. "Good," Alistair nodded, "because we have something better. Eleanor, show him the deed to the Beacon Hill property." Eleanor pulled a document from the folder. "Victoria believes she owns that house because it was part of her family's legacy. But the truth is, the Kensingtons lost that house in a private foreclosure 20 years ago. Your grandfather bought it through an anonymous shell company and leased it to the Kensingtons for $1 a year, just to keep the peace. When you married Victoria, he transferred the lease to the Sterling Family Trust. I looked at the fine print, so she never owned it. Never, Eleanor confirmed. She was a guest in a house owned by the man she just called senile and a pauper, and because she triggered the moral turpitude clause by abandoning a sterling heiress in a foreign country, the lease was terminated instantly. She's not being locked out. She's being evicted for breach of contract. What about the Montgomerys? I asked. Pierce Montgomery is all over those comments. He's promising to handle me. Alistair's smile was predatory. Pierce Montgomery is currently at a high-stakes poker game at the Union Club. He thinks he's about to marry into the sterling fortune through Victoria. He doesn't realize he's about to marry a woman with a net worth of exactly $4,000 and a pile of credit card debt. He leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto mine. Tomorrow is Friday, the day before the gala. Victoria will spend the day trying to rally her friends. She'll try to get a lawyer to stay the eviction, but what she doesn't know is that the lawyer she's going to call the best in Boston is already on my payroll. I sat back, the weight of the plan settling on me. It was a symphony of consequences, every note perfectly timed, but there was still one thing that bothered me. Grandfather, I said, why did you wait so long? You watched her treat me like this for years. You watched Leo turn into that. Alistair sighed, and for a moment, he looked all of his 94 years. Because, Julian, a man has to want to be saved. If I'd stepped in 10 years ago, you would have defended her. You would have told me I was being a cynical old man. I had to let them show you their true faces. I had to let them strip you down to your $12 so you could see that you're worth more than all of their millions combined. He patted my hand. Now, get some sleep. Tomorrow, we let them think they're winning. We let Victoria play her little victim role to the hilt. Because the higher she climbs that pedestal, the further she has to fall. I went to my room, but sleep was a stranger. I kept thinking about the video of Victoria crying. It was so convincing. She was a professional. She had spent her whole life perfecting the art of the lie. I looked at my phone one last time before putting it away. I had a new message. Not from Victoria. Not from Leo. It was from an unknown number. It was a photo. The photo was of my grandfather, Alistair, taken through a long-range lens. He was getting into the SUV at the airport. Below the photo was a single line of text. The old man isn't the only one who's been watching, Julian. You think you're the hunter? Look behind you. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, the shadows of the hotel room suddenly feeling a lot longer. I thought we were the ones in control. I thought the trap was set. What I didn't know yet was that Victoria Harrison had a silent partner, someone who knew exactly who Alistair Sterling was, and someone who had been waiting for the sterling fortune to be consolidated into one hand so they could cut it off at the wrist. The game hadn't just changed. It had turned into a war. I spent the rest of the night staring at that photo, the blue light of the phone screen burning into my retinas. The image was grainy, taken from a distance. Alistair stepping into the SUV, his face illuminated by a street lamp. It wasn't just a photo. It was a map of our movements. Someone had been at the private hangar. Someone knew Alistair wasn't the senile pauper Victoria claimed he was. Grandfather, I said, walking into his bedroom at Sao. Come am. I held out the phone. Alistair put on his glasses, squinted at the screen, and then did something that chilled me more than the text itself. He chuckled. Well, Julian, it seems Silas Vane hasn't lost his touch. He always did enjoy the theatrics of a well-timed threat. Silas Vane? Who is that? Alistair sat on the edge of the bed, the early morning light catching the deep lines of his face. Silas was my head of security 20 years ago. Sharp, ruthless, and ultimately, greedy. He tried to embezzle from the logistics arm, so I buried him. I didn't put him in jail. That would have been too easy. I made sure he could never work in high-level security or finance again. I turned him into a ghost. It seems Victoria has gone ghost hunting. If he's working with her, he knows exactly what we're doing, I said. He knows what he thinks I'm doing, Alistair corrected. Silas thinks I'm still the man I was 20 years ago. He doesn't realize that a man with nothing left to lose like you, Julian, is far more dangerous than a man with an empire to protect. By Chin, Hong am. The escalation moved from digital threats to public execution. I turned on the local news to see Victoria standing on the steps of the Beacon Hill house. She had a microphone in front of her face and a community of support behind her, mostly socialites in Burberry coats holding coffee cups. "My son and I are being terrorized," Victoria told the cameras, her voice trembling with Emmy-worthy precision. "Julian Sterling has used a legal loophole to seize our family home. He's a man who has failed at every venture he's ever touched, and now he's trying to punish us for his own inadequacies. We are standing our ground. This house is a Kensington legacy, and no bitter, unstable man will take it from us." Leo stood beside her, his jaw set, looking every bit the defiant heir. "My father needs help," he told a reporter. "We tried to support him in London, but he's lost touch with reality. We just want him to stay away from us." "They're good," I muttered, gripping the edge of the dresser. "The whole city hates me." "Let them hate you," Eleanor Vance said, walking in with a stack of papers. "Hatred is loud, but it's not a legal defense. Victoria's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, just called. He wants an emergency hearing to stay the eviction. He told Victoria he can tie this up in court for years." "And Marcus Thorne is our guy?" I asked. Eleanor smiled. "Marcus is currently advising Victoria to move all her remaining jewelry and personal assets into a protected offshore account to keep them from being seized." "That account?" "It's a Sterling Global escrow. She's literally handing us the last of her net worth for safekeeping." I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was brilliant, but it was also cruel. I was watching my son's mother dismantle her own life because she was too arrogant to realize she was being played. "I need to see him," I said suddenly. "Who, Alistair?" "No, Leo." "Julian, that's exactly what Silas Vane wants," Eleanor warned. "They want a confrontation. I'm not going to the house. They're having lunch at the Somerset Club at noon. Victoria is meeting with Pierce Montgomery to secure a loan. I want Leo to see me, not as a ghost, but as the man who owns the chair he's sitting in." The Somerset Club is the kind of place where the wallpaper is older than the American Revolution, and the members believe they are the true architects of the world. I arrived at Muirhai, 11 p.m. I wasn't wearing my Target polo. I was wearing a charcoal suit tailored for a man who didn't have to check the price tag. I walked into the dining room, and the air seemed to thin. Conversations faltered, necks turned. I was the mad ex-husband from the morning news. I saw them in a corner booth: Victoria, Leo, and Pierce Montgomery. Pierce was exactly what I expected: 50, tanned, with teeth that were too white and a watch that cost more than a house. He had his arm around Victoria, playing the role of the savior. I walked straight to their table. "Julian." Victoria's voice was a hiss. She tried to maintain her victim face, but the sight of me in a $5,000 suit threw her. "How did you get in here?" "Security." "I'm a legacy member, Victoria. My grandfather's name is on the founding charter," I said smoothly. I looked at my son. "Leo, we need to talk." Leo didn't stand up. He leaned back, his eyes cold and mocking. "You look like you stole that suit, Julian. Did you use the last of those coins I gave you to rent it?" Pierce Montgomery let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "Now, Leo, be nice. Your father is clearly having a manic episode." "Julian, why don't you walk away before I have the club manager call the police? Victoria is under my protection now. You've had your fun with the locks, but that's over." I leaned over the table, placing my hands on the white linen. "Pierce, you're an intelligent man. You've built a nice company, but you're currently backing the wrong horse. Victoria doesn't own the house. She doesn't own the cars, and she certainly doesn't own the Sterling name. I own the Kensington legacy." Victoria snapped, her face turning a blotchy red. "And Pierce is going to buy the house back from your shell company by Monday. We don't need you. We never did." "Is that right, Pierce?" I asked. "You're going to spend $12 million to save her reputation." Pierce tightened his grip on his wine glass. "I'll do whatever is necessary to keep my future wife happy. Now, get out." I looked at Leo one last time. "I wanted to give you a chance, Leo. A real one. I wanted to tell you that you don't have to follow her down this hole. Come with me now. Leave this table, and we can start over. No money, no trusts. Just us." Leo laughed. It was a hollow, ugly sound. "And do what? Go live in your studio apartment, shop for groceries with coupons. You're a loser, Julian. You always have been. Mom was right, you're just taking up space. Go back to your library and leave the real world to men who actually matter." The $12 version of me would have flinched. he would have felt the familiar sting of rejection and slunk away. But that man was dead. He died on the floor of Heathrow. I understand, I said, straightening my jacket. I just wanted to make sure you were all in the same place when the floor gives way. It makes the cleanup much easier. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back, even when I heard Victoria shouting something about a restraining order. I was halfway across the lobby when a man stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar. He was tall, wiry, with silver-flecked hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. He was leaning against the wall, tossing a silver coin into the air and catching it. "Nice suit, Julian," the man said. "Silas Vane, I presume," I said, stopping a few feet away. Silas caught the coin and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Alistair has a lot of faith in you, giving you the keys to the kingdom. But Alistair is old. He's sentimental. He thinks this is a story about justice. And what do you think it is?" Silas stepped closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic clinging to him. "I think it's a story about a fortune that's been sitting in a vault for too long. Victoria and Pierce? They're just the distractions. They're the loud ones. While you're busy bankrupting your ex-wife, you might want to ask yourself why Pierce Montgomery is so eager to jump into this mess." "He thinks he's getting the Sterling Trust," I said. "He doesn't think it," Silas whispered. "He's been shorting sterling steel for 6 months. He's been betting on its collapse. And now that you're the chairman, all he needs is for you to make one massive, public mistake, one scandal that proves you're as unstable as Victoria says you are. And the board will have no choice but to trigger a forced buyout." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about a house or a bitter divorce. Pierce was trying to hostile take over the entire empire, and Victoria was his Trojan horse. "Why are you telling me this, Silas?" Silas flipped the coin again. "Because I like to watch a good fight, and because Alistair still owes me for that ghost thing. Tell the old man I'm not working for Victoria. I'm working for the highest bidder, and right now Pierce Montgomery's check just bounced." He winked and disappeared through the side exit before I could ask another question. I stood in the lobby of the Somerset Club, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The gala tomorrow night wasn't just a celebration of my inheritance, it was a trap. Victoria's public, victim act, the news cameras, the rally at the house, it was all designed to provoke me into an outburst. If I looked like a monster on stage, the investors would panic, the stock would plummet, and Pierce would buy the company for pennies on the dollar. I walked out into the rain and found Eleanor waiting in the SUV. "What happened?" she asked, seeing my face. "Change of plans," I said, my voice cold. "Tell the video crew at the gala to double-check the audio sync. And Eleanor, call the bank. I want to know exactly how much Pierce Montgomery has in his personal accounts." "Why?" "Because by tomorrow night," I said. "I don't just want Victoria and Leo to have nothing. I want Pierce Montgomery to be the one sweeping the floors in my factory." The escalation was complete. The players were on the board. The stakes had risen from a family feud to a $300 million war. But as we drove away, I looked at the $12 I'd taped to the dashboard. It was a reminder of who I was when they left me. And it was a reminder of who I would never be again. I didn't know it yet, but the final betrayal wasn't going to come from Victoria. It was going to come from someone I hadn't even considered, someone who was currently sitting in the very room where the gala was being prepared. The rain in Boston had turned into a thick, oppressive fog by Friday morning, swallowing the golden dome of the State House and turning the brick sidewalks of Beacon Hill into slick, treacherous paths. I sat in the back of the SUV, watching the news cycle on a tablet. Victoria was everywhere. She'd spent the morning on a local talk show, looking pale and fragile in a high-necked cashmere sweater, her voice breaking as she described the emotional trauma of being evicted by a man who had lost his mind to jealousy. "He was always a quiet man," Victoria told the interviewer, dabbing her eyes. "I thought it was humility. Now I realize it was resentment. He couldn't stand that my son and I were moving on, building a life with a man of actual substance like Pierce Montgomery. He's trying to destroy the only home Leo has ever known, just to feel powerful for once." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. She wasn't just fighting for a house. She was preemptively poisoning the well. If the public and the Sterling Global Board believed I was an unstable stalker, the transition of power tomorrow night wouldn't just be difficult, it would be impossible. The board of directors, mostly old-money traditionalists who hated scandal, would move to block my chairmanship before I could even take the oath. "She's good," I muttered, looking at the screen. She's turned the entire city into her personal jury. And you're the defendant, Eleanor Vance said, tapping a pen against her leather-bound folder. But she's made one fatal mistake, Julian. She thinks the public's sympathy is the same thing as legal standing. She's currently holding a candlelight vigil in front of the Beacon Hill house tonight. She's invited the press, her social circle, and anyone who feels outraged by your actions. She wants a spectacle. Then let's give her one, I said, but not the one she's expecting. We spent the afternoon in the war room of Alistair's suite. The plan was no longer just about the inheritance. It was about the total deconstruction of the lie Victoria had lived for 15 years. I started to realize that Victoria's betrayal went even deeper than the stolen code or the divorce. As Eleanor pulled up the private financial records of the Kensington estate, Victoria's family line, the truth began to bleed out of the spreadsheets. "Look at this, Julian," Eleanor said, pointing to a series of transfers from Hang in Lam. I leaned in. It was a massive influx of cash into the Kensington accounts, right around the time I'd been working the hardest to keep our heads above water. "Where did that come from?" "It came from a private equity firm called Blackwood Co., Eleanor replied. "The CEO is Jax Blackwood. He's a known fixer for the Montgomery family." "Victoria didn't just sabotage your software deal in Hang in Lam, Julian. She'd been selling your trade secrets and your logistics data to Pierce Montgomery for years before that. She was literally funding her social life by cannibalizing your career." The room seemed to tilt. I thought about all those nights I'd stayed up late, staring at spreadsheets, wondering why our margins were thinning, why our competitors always seemed one step ahead of us. I thought about the way Victoria would comfort me, telling me that maybe I just wasn't cut out for the big leagues, while she was pocketing the checks for the very information that was sinking me. "She didn't just leave me at Heathrow," I whispered, the weight of a decade of gaslighting finally crashing down. "She spent our entire marriage ensuring I'd never be anything more than her footstool, which is why Pierce Montgomery is so desperate now." Alistair's voice came from the doorway. He looked tired but resolute. "He's been using Victoria to feed on our family's outskirts for years. Now that you're moving into the center of the empire, he's terrified. If you take control, the first thing you'll do is an audit. And an audit will show exactly how Pierce Montgomery built his fortune on stolen sterling data." "What about Leo?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Does he know?" Alistair walked over and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "That's the hardest part, Julian. A boy raised by a wolf doesn't know he's eating sheep. He thinks he's part of the pack. He thinks he's being loyal to the person who protected him." The evening of the vigil arrived. The fog had turned into a light, misting rain. I stood on the balcony of a building across from the Beacon Hill house, looking through a pair of high-powered binoculars. The scene below was surreal. There were at least 50 people gathered on the sidewalk. Victoria was in the center, holding a flickering candle, looking like a tragic saint. Leo stood by her side, his arm around her, glaring at the darkened windows of the house. Pierce Montgomery was there, too, whispering in the ear of a local news reporter. "Look at them," I said to Silas Vane, who was standing in the shadows behind me, checking his watch. "They look like they've already won," Silas said. "They think the house is empty. They think you're hiding in a hotel room, waiting for the lawyers to save you." "Are the cameras ready?" I asked. "Every angle," Silas replied. "We've got feeds into the local news trucks, too. When you give the signal, we override their broadcast." The vigil reached its peak. Victoria stepped toward the cameras, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the candles. "We aren't just here for a house," she told the reporters. "We're here for the principle of family. For the idea that you can't just discard people because you have a legal document and a grudge. Julian Sterling, if you're watching this, look at your son, look at the pain you're causing. Is a pile of bricks worth his love?" Leo stepped forward then, his voice loud and clear. "My father is a coward. He won't show his face because he knows he's a liar. He's always been a loser, and he's trying to take us down with him." The crowd cheered. It was a perfect media moment. The victim mother and the brave son standing up to the tyrant. I picked up my radio. Now, suddenly, the massive iron gates of the Beacon Hill house, the ones Victoria claimed I'd hacked, swung open with a loud, mechanical groan. The crowd gasped and surged back. 2 men in suits stepped out, but they weren't security guards. They were movers, carrying a large, ornate portrait. It was the painting of the Kensington family that had hung in the foyer for 40 years. They walked straight to the sidewalk and set it down in the rain. "What is this?" Victoria screamed, her fragile mask slipping for a split second. Who gave you permission to touch my things? Then, every light in the house snapped on at once, illuminating the interior. It was empty. Completely, jarringly empty. The furniture, the rugs, the chandeliers gone. A voice boomed from the outdoor speaker system, echoing off the surrounding brownstones. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of the Kensington estate's own executor, a man who had died 5 years ago, played from a recorded deposition. And because the Kensington family has failed to maintain the primary residence and has defaulted on the private lease held by the Sterling Family Trust, all contents of the home are hereby forfeited and will be sold at public auction to satisfy the outstanding debts of Victoria Harrison. The crowd went silent. The reporters turned their cameras toward Victoria, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "That's a lie," she shrieked. "I don't owe anyone anything. Pierce, do something." Pierce Montgomery stepped forward, his face pale. "This is a stunt. Julian is just trying to embarrass us. We'll have this overturned in an hour." But the broadcast didn't stop there. On the large news screens that many people were watching on their phones, the feed suddenly switched. It wasn't the vigil anymore. It was a black and white security video from a private office. The date on the corner of the video was from 3 years ago. It showed Victoria sitting across from Pierce Montgomery. She was handing him a thick envelope. "This is the last of the logistics schematics, Pierce." Victoria's voice came through the speakers crystal clear. "If Julian finds out I've been copying his files, he'll kill the divorce settlement. I need that $5 million in the offshore account by Friday. I'm tired of playing the supportive wife to a man who can't even see he's being robbed." Pierce's voice followed. "Don't worry, Victoria. By the time I'm done with him, Julian won't have enough money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone a lawyer. He'll think he just failed. He always does." The silence on the street was deafening. The candles in the crowd began to flicker and go out. The socialites who had been standing behind Victoria began to step away, their faces twisted in a mix of shock and disgust. Leo was staring at the screen, his mouth open, his arm slowly dropping from his mother's shoulder. "Mom?" he whispered. "What? What was that?" Victoria turned to him, her eyes wide and manic. "It's a deepfake, Leo. He's using AI to frame me. Pierce, tell him." But Pierce Montgomery wasn't looking at Leo. He was looking at his phone, his face drained of all color. He'd just received a notification that his personal and corporate accounts had been flagged for an emergency federal audit. "I have to go," Pierce muttered, pushing his way through the crowd, leaving Victoria standing alone in the rain. I watched through the binoculars as my son took a step back from his mother. The look on his face wasn't just confusion anymore. It was the look of a boy seeing the monster under his bed for the first time. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I'd won the battle, but I was watching my son's world shatter in real time. I wanted to run down there, to grab him, to tell him I was sorry he had to see it this way. But I knew if I did, the trap wouldn't close. I had to let him feel the ground fall away. "He's coming," Silas said, pointing to the street. Leo had broken away from Victoria. He was running, not toward the house and not toward his mother's waiting car. He was running toward the subway entrance, disappearing into the dark. Victoria was left on the sidewalk, screaming at the news cameras, her expensive cashmere sweater soaked and clinging to her. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had gambled everything on a lie and finally seen the cards turned over. "Tomorrow is the gala," Alistair said, appearing at my side on the balcony. "The final act." "It's not enough," I said, my voice cold. "Pierce Montgomery is still standing. And Leo. Leo is out there somewhere with nothing." "He has exactly what you had at Heathrow, Julian," Alistair said. "He has the truth. Now we see if he has the sterling blood to do something with it." As we walked back inside, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I expected it to be Silas or Eleanor, but it was a photo of a small, nondescript room in the basement of the hotel where the gala was being held. In the photo, a man I didn't recognize was sitting in front of a bank of monitors. He was wearing a headset, and he was looking at a blueprint of the gala's ballroom. The text below the photo read, "The video you played tonight was a nice touch, Julian, but Pierce Montgomery doesn't play with videos. He plays with fire. If you walk onto that stage tomorrow, you won't be finishing your speech." I looked at the $12 I'd kept in my pocket. The stakes had just moved from reputation and money to life and death. What I didn't know yet was that the man in the basement wasn't working for Pierce. He was working for the person who had been the silent partner in my marriage all along, the one person who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried because she'd helped dig the holes. My sister, Sarah Sterling, the everyday daughter who had been helping Alistair for years. The betrayal was no longer coming from my enemies. It was coming from the very heart of the family I was trying to save. The revelation of the photo sent a chill through me that the Boston fog couldn't match. I stared at the image of the man in the basement, then at the name on my screen, Sarah, my sister. The grounded Sterling. She had spent the last decade playing the role of the sympathetic sibling, calling me every few months to check in on my mental health, always subtly reinforcing the idea that I was the fragile one, the one who couldn't handle the family legacy. "Grandfather," I said, my voice barely a rasp. "Sarah sent this, or someone using her phone." Alistair took the phone, his face hardening into a mask of carved granite. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Sarah always did have more of her grandmother's hunger than your father's heart," he sighed. "She didn't want the chairmanship, Julian. She wanted the dissolution. She's been working with Pierce to ensure that when the empire falls, it falls into a dozen different pieces she can buy back for a fraction of their worth. She's been watching me suffer for 3 years," I said, the realization stinging more than Victoria's coins. She knew about the sabotage. She knew about Heathrow. "She didn't just know, Julian," Eleanor Vance added, stepping into the light of the study. "She's the one who suggested the character and integrity clause to Alistair. She thought you'd fail it. She thought under the pressure of Victoria's cruelty, you'd snap, do something violent or illegal, and disqualify yourself forever. You were supposed to be the sacrificial lamb." I looked at the $12 on the desk. They all thought I was a puppet. Victoria thought I was a footstool. Sarah thought I was a pawn. Pierce thought I was a casualty. "They've underestimated the man who has nothing left to lose," I said. The night before the gala was a blur of tactical movements. We didn't go to the police. In the world of the Sterlings, the police were for people who didn't have the resources to settle their own debts. Instead, Silas Vane and his team disappeared into the bowels of the hotel. If there was a man in the basement waiting to disrupt my ascension, he was about to find out that Silas was the shark in those particular waters. Saturday morning arrived with a deceptive calm. The news was still reeling from the vigil video. Victoria had retreated to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. Pierce had refused to pay for her hotel room after the audit hit. Her social media accounts had been deactivated. The Harrison name was toxic. At home p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Leo. "I'm at the library, the one you used to work at. Can we talk?" I went alone, despite Alistair's protests. The library was quiet, smelling of old paper and floor wax, the smell of my life for the last 3 years. I found Leo in the back, sitting at the very desk where I'd spent hundreds of hours researching archives. He looked small. His designer jacket was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. "I saw the audit files on your computer once," Leo said without looking up. "A few years ago, I thought you were just obsessed with failing. I didn't realize you were looking for the person who'd stabbed you in the back." "I was looking for the truth, Leo," I said, sitting across from him. "It just took me a long time to accept it." Leo finally looked at me, and for the first time in a decade, I saw my son, not the Harrison heir, but the boy I'd taught to ride a bike. "She told me you hated us. She told me you were hiding money from us so we'd stay poor while you built a secret fortune. Everything she did. She told me it was to protect me from your resentment. And now I have 84 cents in my pocket and no place to sleep," Leo said, a bitter laugh escaping him. "I guess I'm the studio apartment version of a Sterling now, huh?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled $5 bill, part of the 12 I'd kept. I slid it across the table. "That's for lunch. Not a steakhouse lunch. A real one. Meet me at the gala tonight, Leo. Not as my son, and not as an heir. Meet me as a witness." "A witness to what?" "To the end of the lies," I said. The Sterling Global Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. 500 of the most powerful people in New England were in attendance. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone knew the failure. Julian Sterling was about to be named chairman. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage, adjusting my cuffs. My sister, Sarah, was standing a few feet away, looking radiant in a gown of shimmering silver. She walked over, a glass of champagne in her hand, her smile perfect. "You look nervous, Jules," she whispered, her voice like honey in glass. "It's a big responsibility. If you feel like it's too much, If you feel like you're going to have another episode, like Victoria said, I'm right here to take the mic. For the family. I'm sure you are, Sarah, I said, looking her dead in the eye. But the thing about the family is, we've started documenting our episodes lately. It's a new Sterling tradition. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered. I don't know what you mean. You will? I said. The master of ceremonies took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the man you've all been waiting for, the new chairman of Sterling Global, Mr. Julian Sterling. The applause was hesitant, scattered with whispers. I walked out into the blinding glare of the spotlights. I could see the board members in the front row, their faces grim. I could see Pierce Montgomery in the back, leaning against a pillar, a smug look on his face. He thought he had the man in the basement. He thought the fire was coming. I reached the podium. I didn't look at my notes. I looked at the crowd. Most of you know me as the man who was left at Heathrow with $12, I began, my voice echoing through the silent hall. My ex-wife and my son thought that was the price of my worth. My sister thought it was the price of my silence. And Pierce Montgomery thought it was the price of my empire. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah moved toward the edge of the stage, her hand reaching for the MC's arm. But $12 is a powerful thing, I continued. It's enough to buy a notebook. It's enough to buy a few hours of internet at a cafe. And it's enough to realize that when you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. I clicked a remote in my hand. The massive screen behind me didn't show the Sterling Global logo. It showed a series of wire transfers. These are the records from Blackwood Co., I said. They show the $20 million Sarah Sterling funneled to Pierce Montgomery to help him short our own company's stock. They show the $3 million Pierce paid to Sarah to ensure Alistair was kept in the dark about the logistics sabotage. Sarah froze. Pierce started to move toward the exit, but the doors didn't open. Silas Vane and 4 men in suits were standing there, their arms crossed. And this, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum, is the audio from the basement of this very hotel, recorded 20 minutes ago. The speakers crackled. A man's voice, the man from the photo, was pleading. I was just supposed to trigger the fire alarm. Pierce said it would cause a panic. He said Julian would look like a failure during the evacuation. I didn't know about the gas lines, I swear. The ballroom erupted. People stood up, knocking over chairs. The board members were on their feet, staring at Pierce and Sarah in horror. I looked at my sister. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked like a trapped animal. You're a Sterling, Julian, she hissed, stepping toward the podium. You wouldn't destroy the family name like this. I'm not destroying the family, Sarah, I said, stepping back from the mic so only she could hear me. I'm pruning it. You and Victoria were the rot. I'm just the gardener. I turned back to the audience. Effective immediately, Sarah Sterling is removed from all family trusts. Pierce Montgomery's corporate assets have been frozen by the SEC following the evidence we provided this morning. And as for Victoria Harrison, I gestured to the side of the stage. A side door opened, and Victoria was led in by 2 security guards. She wasn't in cashmere anymore. She was wearing a cheap tracksuit, her face haggard. She'd been brought here to witness her own final signature, the one that would legally transfer her remaining offshore assets to the Sterling Foundation. Sign it, Victoria, I said, gesturing to the tablet on the podium. Or we play the video of you and Sarah discussing the Heathrow plan in the Beacon Hill kitchen. I have that one too. Victoria looked at the crowd, the people she had spent her life trying to impress. They were looking at her with nothing but loathing. She picked up the stylus, her hand shaking, and signed away the last of her stolen life. The room was silent as she was led away. I looked out into the crowd and saw Leo. He was standing near the back, watching me. He didn't look like a prince or a victim. He looked like a man who had finally seen the sun after a long night. The Sterling Foundation will be pivoting, I announced. We aren't just giving to charities. We're building a program for those who have been discarded by their families, for the ones who have been told they're worthless, because I know exactly what you can build with $12 and the truth. The applause this time wasn't hesitant, it was a roar. I walked off the stage, past my sister, who was being approached by 2 plainclothes officers. I walked straight to the back of the room, to my son. You came, I said. Leo looked at the $5 bill in his hand. I bought a sandwich. It was the best thing I've ever tasted. He looked at me, his eyes wet. What now, Dad? I looked at the $12 I'd kept for so long. I took them out of my pocket and handed them to him. Now, I said, we go back to that library. We've got a lot of work to do, and this time, we're building something that can't be bought, sold, or sabotaged. As we walked out of the ballroom, leaving the chaos of the elite behind us, I didn't feel like a billionaire. I didn't feel like a titan. I felt like a father. Revenge is a cold meal, they say. But justice? Justice is the first warm day after a long London winter. The high of the gala was a fever dream, but the morning after felt like a clean, sharp blade. I woke up in the penthouse of the Four Seasons, not to the sound of Victoria's mocking laughter or the chime of a luxury car alert, but to the silence of a man who finally owned his own soul. On the bedside table sat those 12 crumpled dollars, encased now in a simple glass frame. They were the most expensive pieces of paper I owned. By Tam, Home AM, the fallout was catastrophic for everyone who had bet against the failure. Pierce Montgomery's firm, Montgomery Global, saw its stock price plunge 1% in pre-market trading as news of the SEC audit and the attempted sabotage at the Fairmont went viral. By noon, his board of directors had voted to strip him of his CEO title. He wasn't just losing his money, he was losing his identity. A man like Pierce doesn't know how to exist without a title to hide behind. My sister, Sarah, was released on bail, but the Sterling name had been purged from her legal identity. Grandfather had seen to that. She was no longer Sarah Sterling. She was Sarah Miller, using our mother's maiden name, and she was barred from entering any Sterling property for the rest of her life. She'd tried to call me 6 times that morning, but I didn't answer. There's no dialogue left for someone who tries to burn down the house while you're sleeping in it. But the most satisfying closure came 3 days later. I received a notification from the security team at the Sterling Logistics warehouse in South Boston. A woman was at the gates, demanding to see me. I knew who it was before they even described the disheveled blonde in the oversized sunglasses. I drove down there myself. I didn't take the limousine. I took the old, silver sedan. I'd kept the one with the Tamui Chin, hung miles in the dented bumper. I wanted her to see the car she'd spent years calling a poverty trap. Victoria was standing by the chain-link fence, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The tracksuit was stained, and her designer handbag, the one she'd refused to let go of, looked frayed at the edges. "Julian," she said, as I stepped out of the car. Her voice didn't have that melodic Beacon Hill lilt anymore. It was thin and desperate. "The motel, they kicked me out this morning. My personal cards are all declined, even the ones I thought were private." "Those weren't private, Victoria. Those were funded by the trade secrets you stole from me," I said, leaning against the hood of the car. "I just took back what was mine." "I have nothing," she whispered, her eyes darting to the warehouse. "I heard you're hiring here, for the packing line." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the coins on the floor at Heathrow. I thought about the 10 years she'd spent whispering in Leo's ear that I was a ghost. "The packing line requires a certain level of integrity, Victoria," I said, "and the ability to work for what you have. I don't think you're qualified for that. But I did authorize a one-time payment to a local shelter in your name. They have a bed for you tonight." "Julian, please." She stepped toward me, her hand reaching out. "We were a family. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It means everything," I said, opening my car door. "That's why I'm taking care of the only family I have left." I drove away, watching her in the rearview mirror, until she was just a small, dark speck against the industrial gray of the city. She'd spent her life looking for the highest bidder, and she'd finally realized that when the auction ends, if you haven't built anything of your own, you're just left standing in an empty room. I drove to a small, quiet park near the library. Leo was waiting there on a bench. He had a backpack and a notebook. He'd spent the last 3 days working at a local community garden, earning enough for his own bus pass. "Grandfather wants to see you," I said as he got into the car. "He wants to talk to you about a scholarship program. Not a trust fund, Leo, a scholarship. You'll have to maintain a BAFI Numui GPA and work 20 hours a week in the Sterling archives." Leo looked at the dented dashboard of the car, then at me. He reached out and touched the glass-framed $12 I'd brought with me. "I think I can handle that, Dad," he said. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't call me Julian. We drove toward the Sterling estate, not as a titan and his heir, but as 2 men who had survived a shipwreck and were finally learning how to walk on solid ground. My grandfather was waiting for us on the porch of the big house. He looked at the 2 of us, then at the old, rattling car. He smiled a real, warm smile that reached his eyes. "You're late," Alistair said. "Traffic was heavy," I replied, stepping onto the porch. "And we had to make a stop." "For what?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, shiny silver coin, the one Silas Vane had been flipping. I handed it to my grandfather. "To remind us," I said, "that the price of a man isn't what he can buy. It's what he refuses to sell." The Sterling Empire would go on. The logistics would move, the steel would be forged, and the millions would be given away to those who actually needed them. But in that moment, standing on the porch with my father's father and my own son, I realized the true revenge wasn't the money I'd taken back. The true revenge was the fact that I could finally look in the mirror and see a man who was no longer a failure, no longer a ghost, and no longer alone. I was Julian Sterling, and I was finally home.